This is chapter 6, which is called Personnel Selection. In this chapter, we will be discussing methods that organizations use to decide who to hire. Personnel selection procedures are defined as a wide range of instruments that organizations can use to predict job performance. This includes tests and other types of assessments such as interviews, assessment centers, and simulations. Basically, the personnel selection procedures are how the organization selects their personnel. It's how they choose their workers. These tests can be done in an unproctored internet testing, which means the prospective employees just take the test online, or through pencil and paper tests, which are actual written tests. When we look at selection procedures, there are lots of different types. So let's start by differentiating between individually administered selection procedures and group administered selection procedures. As you can imagine, individually administered ones are administered individually, one person at a time. These can either be done in person or on the internet or the phone. Group selection procedures are done all together in a group. As you can see in the picture, they're all taking a test on the computer at the same time. They can also be done with pencil and paper tests. Another way to differentiate between types of tests is the difference between speed tests and power tests. Speed tests are timed and power tests are not. Next is the difference between cognitive tests and non-cognitive tests. This one's actually quite important. In general, cognitive tests measure cognitive ability, general intelligence, or specific cognitive abilities. Maybe how well you notice errors in written work or your mechanical ability, things like that. Non-cognitive tests are more about personality, not about your actual intelligence or cognitive skills. It's important to remember that different organizations may want different selection procedures because they're looking to measure different constructs after in terms of job performance. In this diagram, we can see that two different organizations both use a specific selection procedure, but the one on the left is looking to measure job knowledge in order to see how well their employees are doing, whereas the one on the right is going to measure interpersonal skills. Since these organizations have different goals for their employees, different constructs that they think mean doing a good job, they might want to consider using different selection procedures. When choosing a selection procedure, one of the most important things to consider is called utility. Utility is defined as the dollar value of using a selection procedure. It's determined by three things: the procedure's validity, the cost of using it, and the benefit it provides to the organization. All of these can be brought down into sort of like a number that allows them to define the utility of the selection procedure. Something else to consider when choosing a selection procedure is the adverse impact. This is the degree to which there are mean differences in the performance of different subgroups. So if I have a test for hiring and Black people always score lower than white people on this test, that means it has adverse impact. It doesn't actually measure how good they are at doing the job because their race is mediating that. Same with men versus women. This can even have an issue with non-English speakers in America. The final definition on this page just tells us what a battery of selection procedures means. Battery means there's like a whole bunch of them, a whole selection of them. So when there's a group of selection procedures used together, we call that a battery of selection procedures or a test battery. Most jobs provide a test battery. They don't just give one test to see if possible employees are cut out for the job. They'll give several tests, a battery of them. We'll now discuss tests of cognitive abilities, and then we'll go on to the non-cognitive tests. So remember that cognitive tests measure your cognitive abilities, either your general cognitive abilities, your intelligence, or specific cognitive abilities. General cognitive abilities, which are basically your general intelligence, can be called G. They're known by lowercase letter g. Cognitive ability is actually one of the best predictors of job performance. So in almost all jobs, basically all jobs, for the most part, the smarter you are, the better you're going to be at the job. The cognitive ability allows workers to learn their job more quickly. It's also a good predictor of core task performance, especially for complex jobs, as you could imagine. General cognitive ability actually includes three different components: reasoning, symbolic representation, and problem solving. Those are all the components of general cognitive ability. Cognitive abilities have also been described as a person's ability to perceive, process, evaluate, compare, create, understand, manipulate, or generally think about information and ideas. On the right, we can see an example of the Wonderlic cognitive ability test. This is a common one that is used as a job selection test. If you like, you can pause the video now and take a look at the test. If you want, cover the answers, do it yourself just for fun, and see how you score. You don't have to. The problem with these types of tests is that they're actually biased towards white people. All of our standardized intelligence tests are, and that's a big problem in America, a big problem with these types of cognitive ability tests. When we can truly measure somebody's cognitive ability, it is a good predictor of their job performance. But sometimes these tests don't truly measure cognitive ability, especially in people of color. The next type of cognitive ability test is different than the first general cognitive ability. This is a specific one. Specific cognitive ability tests do not assess G, the general intelligence, but instead they assess specific dimensions, such as mechanical ability or clerical speed and accuracy. The example on the right is one of the questions from the Bennett Mechanical Comprehension Test. If you're applying for a job that requires mechanical skills and mechanical thinking, there's a good chance they'll have you take the Bennett test. Feel free to pause and look at the question. The answer, by the way, is A. The measures of specific abilities generally are correlated with G. So people who are smarter in general are better at these specific abilities, presumably because their general intelligence allows them to develop these specific abilities. Another type of test someone can be asked to take is called a psychomotor test. This one actually assesses your coordination or your dexterity. In this example, the person taking the test is told to press certain colors or certain numbers, and they need to see how quickly and accurately they can do it. Psychomotor tests should be related to core job tasks. They shouldn't make somebody do this if their job doesn't have tasks related to dexterity like this. Now we'll talk about personality tests, which are a type of non-cognitive assessment. One of the most frequently used personnel selection methods is the personality test. Probably even more frequent than the intelligence tests. Personality tests are used more often. There's many different tests that are used to measure the same constructs of personality. And these constructs are considered the 5-factor model, or the big 5 of personality. These 5 components include openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These 5 components of personality can be measured with lots of different tests. So there's no such thing as a specific Big 5 test. There's lots of different Big 5 tests or 5-factor model tests that will give you a score on each of these 5 dimensions. The validities of the Big 5 are fairly modest, meaning that the way that they test them, they don't always include everything that they should. It's not the most valid test, but they're very inexpensive. They're easy to do, they're cheap, they don't cost a lot to the organization in terms of time or money, so that's why they're used so much, even though they don't have the best validity. What's very important to employers is that personality tests can generally show low adverse impact against protected groups. So that's what we were talking about on the previous slide. The adverse impact is when Certain ethnicities or races or genders generally score lower on a test. That's a problem that we talked about with the intelligence tests. Luckily, with personality tests, this is not an issue. So basically, the reason they're so popular is they're cheap and easy to do, and they don't have adverse impact. They're fair to all types of people. Let's look again at the big five, the 5 factors of personality. As you can see on the left, if you look at the first letter of each factor, it spells the word ocean. That's how I remember them. O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism, spells ocean. As you can see on the right-hand side, the top 3 are very good predictors of job performance. Let's look at it a little bit deeper. The top one says openness to experience. This includes being interested in learning and culture, and it's a predictor of success in training. People with high scores of openness do very well in training programs. Second is conscientiousness, which includes dimensions such as achievement orientation, detail orientation, and dependability. Basically, they're organized, focused on achievement, details, that sort of thing. Conscientiousness is the most consistent of the big 5 in predicting performance across all jobs. So somebody who scores well on the conscientiousness scale will do well at pretty much every job. Although, as we'll mention later, sometimes more isn't always better. There could be an optimal level that isn't necessarily the highest score possible. Third, we'll look at extroversion, which includes being sociable, assertive, and friendly. Extroversion is a good predictor of performance for sales and management jobs and is also related to training performance. As you can imagine, someone who's very outgoing, sociable, and friendly would be good at sales or management. Underneath that is agreeableness, which they explain includes being compliant, kind, and sympathetic to others. As you can imagine, this is a good trait to have as a worker. And neuroticism includes being anxious or easily upset. This one most likely only affects job performance at very high levels. Someone who scores very high on neuroticism might not have the best job performance in all types of jobs. There are some issues with personality tests. As we mentioned, the good thing is that they don't have the adverse impacts. They don't have mean differences between ethnicities, races, and genders. That's a great thing. They're also fairly cheap and easy to do, so that's a great thing. But there are a few issues with personality tests. However, there are some ways to make them better. Number 1 says to use an at-work frame of reference. We talked about how the validity of personality tests is kind of low, but this can be improved by having the employees imagine they're at work when they answer the questions. So you're not just sitting at home answering the question, do I like to talk to new people? You're thinking, okay, I'm at work, I'm in the factory, I'm working, do I want to talk to new people? They actually put themselves in the frame of mind like they're at the specific job and then answer the personality questions. This has been shown to increase the validity. Number 2 mentions sub-traits. Each of our 5 scales actually has about 5 sub-scales. On this slide, I gave the example of agreeableness. Agreeableness is the general trait, and it can be broken down into trust, earnestness, altruism, cooperation, and modesty. By looking at the sub-traits, you can predict job performance more specifically. Number 3 talks about faking. As you can imagine, some of these things are inherently not very good. You can just read the question and realize that your boss wants you to answer yes or wants you to answer no to that. So faking can be reduced by adding more questions, adding questions that ask the opposite way. But research has found that faking doesn't really affect the test that much. It's not that big of a deal. Most people don't do it very much, and it's kind of easy to tell. Finally, what I mentioned earlier about looking at optimal levels of each dimension. So agreeableness may be a good thing up to a certain point, but once you become too agreeable, perhaps you're not as cut out for that job. So more research should be done to look for the exact optimal level of each dimension for a specific job. Let's talk a little bit about some other parts of personality. We've been focusing on the big five, and those are the big five. They're important. But there are some other personality constructs as well, such as proactive personality, which is the tendency to recognize and act on opportunities in the environment, right? To be proactive, see what opportunities are there and take them. Adaptability is the tendency to adjust to new situations and includes learning adaptability, interpersonal adaptability, and cultural adaptability. 3 different kinds, right? How well you adapt to new situations when you're learning, when you're socializing, and when you're in a new culture. Very important for a lot of jobs. Emotional intelligence is more of a cognitive skill, although it does involve personality a little bit. It can be used to predict social skills at work, which is very important, as we talked about in the last chapter about the context-based tasks, right? When you're doing things that make you get along well with others at work, emotional intelligence is very important. And finally, core self-evaluations. That's sort of like what you think about yourself, your self-esteem, your locus of control, self-efficacy, how well you can assess yourself and handle your own personality. Over on the right-hand side is a little interesting tidbit about proactive personality. There was a study back in 1995 that found that proactive personality could predict the sales performance of real estate agents. It also predicted performance more than conscientiousness or extroversion, suggesting that proactive personality is different from the big five. So for the most part, we use the big five to predict job performance, but when this study, these researchers, Krant and his colleagues, studied proactive personality, they found that it was able to predict sales performance of the real estate agents more than the big five was able to. So especially for certain jobs, this might be something that we don't want to overlook. Integrity tests are different than personality tests. They're also non-cognitive. It's not assessing your intelligence or your cognitive skills. It's kind of assessing how good of a person you are. Integrity tests are tests developed to predict a number of negative and counterproductive employee behaviors, such as theft, drug use, aggression. Integrity tests are a little bit tricky because the overt questions, which are straightforward, it can be kind of obvious what you are supposed to answer. For example, I would hit someone if they insulted me. Even if it's true that you might hit somebody who insults you, there's a good chance you're going to write no on your test when you're applying for a job. So, researchers have developed covert questions, personality-based questions, that have been correlated to things like aggression or violence. For example, I look for excitement and thrills at work. This is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but if enough of these covert questions are answered yes, it would imply or suggest that the person could be aggressive or sneaky or a drug user or any of the number of counterproductive things that employers are looking for. Integrity tests can be very useful because not only do they predict your job performance, but they also predict the negative work outcomes, which obviously any employer would like to avoid. All right, we're going to talk about interviews. This is the last main part of the chapter. Interviews are by far the most common selection procedure. Most likely every job you've ever gotten required an interview. The interview gives employers a chance to find out about the applicant and their KSAOs, their knowledge and skills, but it also gives the applicant a chance to learn about the job. And it gives the organization a chance to sort of sell the job, tell the applicant why they want the job, what it's going to be like, what's good about having this job. During an interview, sometimes something called an RJP, a realistic job preview, is conducted. This is just a preview to the applicant of what the job will look like. It can be a video or a verbal explanation or even a simulation that will let them know during the interview what the job is going to be like. Interestingly, online interviews are becoming the norm in many organizations. Perhaps you've participated in an online interview, especially during COVID times. There are two main types of interviews, unstructured and structured. As you can imagine, unstructured doesn't really have a structure. The questions are not decided ahead of time. It's more like a casual conversation. Different applicants can be asked different questions, and sometimes the questions aren't really job related or can get off topic. These aren't necessarily a bad thing. An unstructured interview is a good way to get to know the candidates. But structured interviews may be better, depending on the job. A structured interview is where all the applicants are asked the same job-related questions. So unstructured can be different questions for different people, and they're not necessarily related to the job. Whereas a structured interview is the same for all the applicants, and the questions are all job-related. A structured interview can be done several ways. It can be done as a situational interview, where applicants are asked job-related questions about hypothetical situations, or a behavioral interview where they're asked job-related questions about real past experiences. So the situational one is more hypothetical. What would you do if your manager asked you to stay late? Versus behavioral, which asks real-life experiences. Tell me about a time when a manager has asked you something that you couldn't do. How did you handle it? Interview questions can be generated from the job analysis. It's very important, in fact, that they are generated from the job analysis. And it's really good if the SMEs, the subject matter experts, can either write the questions or help the person developing the interview. We don't want someone who's unfamiliar with the job to work on writing the interview. We want someone who really understands the job and the constructs that are going to be measured in job performance afterwards. It's also best to use multiple raters for the interview, meaning there's not just one interviewer scoring the questions, there's multiple. These raters should also be trained in the specific interview that they're conducting, and they should take notes to avoid memory problems or, forgetting some details. Now that we've discussed interviews, we'll talk real quick about a few other types of selection procedures. There's the work sample test, where the person applying for the job is actually asked to do the job for just a little bit to see how they do. Then there's assessment centers, which are meant for people who might be promoted to management positions. They go to an assessment center, which is an actual location, and can participate in different types of situational tests. One is called role play, where the candidates play out a situation they might encounter on the job. They act out what they would do in certain situations. There's something else called a leaderless group discussion, where the candidates all get together and they're presented with a problem and they need to work on it as a team or as a group without one person designated as the leader. And finally, there's something called an inbox, in-basket exercise, where the management candidates are given memos or emails. They need to review them, put them in order of priority, and explain how they would respond to them. So all of these are situational simulations, right? They're showing how they would act if they were promoted to be management. Finally, we talk about situational judgment tests, SJTs. These put the job applicant into a work-related situation and ask what they believe is the right action. So they're not necessarily doing the work, but they're more asked to imagine that they're in a situation at work, and then they tell with how they would handle it. All right, we are almost done. This one just talks about some more data that's conducted when organizations are hiring. So on top of the specific selection procedures we've discussed, the interviews and the tests and the situational stuff, it's also important to collect biodata. Biodata is biological data, information about the person. These include questions about an applicant's education or past experiences that will allow the employer to judge how well the applicant can perform the job. T&E forms are training and experience forms. Those need to be scored by a trained rater. They're very technical, and the rater needs to understand the form in order to score them. Resumes are another important thing. Resumes can be a little tricky. They're very common, as you can imagine, to give a resume or a CV when you're applying for a job. But the applicants are the ones in control of the information. It's even though there's set standards for resumes, every resume looks a little bit different and can include different information. So it's very hard to compare resumes in a meaningful way. That's why personnel selection is so important, developing more procedures other than just looking at resumes. Most employers conduct reference checks. Often references are found on the resume. But there is a validity issue with references since the employees are the ones who choose their references. Obviously, they're not going to give the name and number of somebody who hates them, is going to say terrible things about them. Another type of test is a physical ability test. We didn't include these in the previous tests, although it is a non-cognitive type of test. And usually this is only done if the job itself requires a specific physical ability. They need to make sure that the applicants can handle it. Although it's important to take into account that they might be further trained once they're hired. They don't need to be totally physically ready for the job before they get it. Finally, credit scores are used by many employers, but they don't necessarily predict job performance, and as you can imagine, are unfair to minority groups. So these are 6 more types of information that can be collected by employers when performing selection procedures. That is it. We are on to the review. Let's try and get through the review nice and quick. I'll start up at the top. Personnel selection procedures include all the different instruments that organizations can use to predict job performance. And why are they predicting job performance? Because they're hiring. They want to hire people who will perform well on the job. An unproctored internet testing is when tests are done online. Pencil and paper tests are administered in a paper format in person. Selection procedures can be done individually or in a group. Speed tests are timed while power tests are not. Cognitive tests can measure your general intelligence or your specific cognitive abilities. Non-cognitive tests measure personality constructs, specifically the Big Five. Utility is determined by 3 things: validity, cost, and benefit to the organization. That's the utility of the personnel selection procedure, the type of selection procedure. Adverse impact is really important. This is when a selection procedure is unfair to a certain group of people. A battery of selection procedures just means that there's several, a group of procedures used together. General cognitive ability, called lowercase g, is one of the best predictors of job performance. It allows workers to learn their job faster. They learn new tasks faster. But as we mentioned, there is adverse impact of the general cognitive tests. They're not fair to minority groups. Specific cognitive ability tests assess a specific ability, such as mechanical thinking. Psychomotor tests assess dexterity and coordination. Remember, that's the one where the guy was pressing the different colored buttons and different numbers. Personality tests in general assess the Big Five. There's many tests which all measure the same constructs, and these 5 constructs, the Big Five, are very useful in predicting job performance. The Big Five are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Remember, the first letter of each one spells out the word ocean. When using personality tests, there's 4 ways to lessen the issues that are inherent with them. 1 is to use an at-work frame of reference. Have the employee pretend that they're at work when answering the questions. Number 2, focus on the sub-traits, the sub-scales of each major scale. Number 3, reduce faking. And number 4, identify optimal scores. Remember, higher is not always better. Other personality constructs outside of the Big Five include proactive personality, your tendency to act on opportunities. Adaptability, being able to adapt to new environments, new people, new cultures. Emotional intelligence, and core self-evaluation. Integrity tests are used to predict negative job behaviors. In an integrity test, the questions can be overt, which are obvious questions, would you hit somebody at work? Or covert, which are less obvious. They ask more about the personality traits associated with those negative behaviors. Integrity tests have been found to predict negative behaviors and overall job performance. Interviews are the most common type of selection procedure. Interviews can be unstructured, meaning they're different for everyone, and some of the questions might not have to do with the job itself. Or structured interviews, in which the questions are decided beforehand, they're the same for everybody, and they're all job related. Structured interviews can be situational, where you say what you would do in a situation, or behavioral, where you tell true stories of what you did do. The best interviews use multiple raters to rate the interview, and these raters are trained and take notes. Assessment centers are places where potential management go to do different types of role-playing situations, like the inbox one where they respond to memos and prioritize them, or the leaderless group where they get together and work as a team to solve a problem. And finally, biodata is biographical information related to how well a candidate can do the job. This can include things like credit scores, education, references, all of that kind of stuff. That's it for Chapter 6, Personnel Selection. As usual, please send me an email if you have any questions. Thank you for watching.